The morning was quiet, too quiet. The sun was just starting to rise, painting the sky in soft gold and orange. Birds sang and the street was calm. But inside that peaceful neighborhood, one man's life was about to turn upside down. James sat on his porch, his wheelchair parked beside him. His loyal dog Max lay at his feet, wagging his tail. James had always loved mornings, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of the wind. But ever since the accident that took his ability to walk, even stepping outside had become a challenge. That's why the new ramp meant everything to him. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden ramp leading from his porch to the driveway. But to James it was freedom. For the first time in months, he could leave his house without calling for help. He had worked hard, saved money, and finally built something that gave him back a piece of his old life. He smiled, watching Max chase a leaf down the path. For a moment, everything felt right. Until he saw it. A flash of red on his door. James rolled closer, frowning. A thick envelope flapped in the morning breeze, stamped with bold black letters. Homeowners Association Notice of Violation. His chest tightened. He tore it open and began to read. Unauthorized structure detected. Remove immediately or face daily fines. His heart sank. He read it again. Then again. The words didn't change. They wanted him to remove his wheelchair ramp. For a moment he just sat there, silent, staring at the paper in disbelief. His ramp wasn't hurting anyone. It didn't block anything. It just helped him live. Then anger slowly replaced the shock. His hands shook as he looked around at the perfect lawns, the painted fences, the identical mailboxes. The neighborhood looked peaceful, but it suddenly felt cold, like the people behind those windows were watching him, judging him. He had given everything to serve his country, and now the people meant to protect his community were turning against him, over a simple wooden ramp. The wind began to rise, brushing against the flag that hung near his porch. Thunder rolled far away, deep and rumbling like a warning. Max let out a low growl, sensing the tension in his owner's voice. James looked at the ramp, then at the red envelope in his hand. He could almost hear the HOA board members' voices, cold, strict, and distant. Rules are rules. Community image must be maintained. Remove it or pay the price. He closed his eyes, holding the letter tightly. His voice was calm but filled with fire. They're not taking this from me. The sky darkened as the wind picked up. Leaves scattered across the yard. Somewhere in the distance, thunder echoed again, louder this time. That was the moment everything changed. Because what the HOA didn't know was that James wasn't going to give up quietly. This wasn't just about a ramp anymore. This was about dignity. About standing up, even when you can't stand. And the fight that was about to begin would shake the entire neighborhood. The next morning, James sat at his kitchen table with the violation notice spread out in front of him. The words were sharp and cold, printed in bold letters like a threat. Failure to comply within 7 days will result in daily fines of $500. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He couldn't afford that. Not on his veteran's pension. But removing the ramp wasn't an option either. It was his only way in and out of the house. He picked up his phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the notice. A woman answered, her voice flat and distant. Homeowners Association office. How may I help you? This is James Parker from Elmwood Drive, he said, trying to stay calm. I received a notice about my wheelchair ramp. I just want to understand what the issue is. There was a pause. Papers shuffled. Yes, she finally replied. The ramp violates Section 14, Article 3, Exterior Modifications. All structures require prior HOA approval. James clenched his jaw. It's a wheelchair ramp. I built it because I can't walk anymore. Surely there's an exception for... I'm sorry, sir, she interrupted, her tone mechanical. Rules are rules. You can submit a request for review, but it may take up to 90 days for approval. 90 days? He couldn't even get down his porch steps without it. After the call ended, James just sat there, staring at his hands. His knuckles were white. The ramp was safe, simple, and necessary, but somehow it had become a crime. By afternoon, he decided to attend the next HOA meeting. If they wanted a fight, he would face them directly. That evening, he rolled into the small community hall where the board met. The room smelled like coffee and carpet cleaner. People chatted quietly as the board members sat behind a long table at the front, their HOA badges gleaming under the lights. The president, Mr. Collins, was a tall man with a sharp suit and an even sharper expression. When James entered, the room fell silent. Ah, Mr. Parker, Collins said smoothly. I see you received our notice. Yes, James replied. And I'm here to explain why that ramp is necessary. It's not decoration, it's my access to the world outside. Collins adjusted his glasses. We understand, but community standards must be maintained. You didn't file a request. James' voice rose. I didn't think I needed permission to be able to leave my house. Murmurs filled the room. Some neighbors looked sympathetic. Others looked away, pretending not to hear. Collins simply smiled, that cold, controlled kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Rules are rules, Mr. Parker. If we make one exception, we open the door for chaos. James looked around the room, searching for even one face that would stand up for him. None did. He wheeled himself back, his voice quiet but steady. Then I'll see what happens when you try to stop a man from living his life. As he left the room, the sound of rain began to fall outside, slow at first, then heavy, echoing against the pavement. It wasn't just a storm outside. It was the beginning of a war inside that neighborhood. James didn't know it yet, but this fight would soon go far beyond one ramp, and expose the dark side of the HOA itself. Rain poured down all night, tapping against the windows like restless fingers. James couldn't sleep. The HOA meeting replayed in his head again and again, Colin's smug face, the cold silence from the neighbors, the way his words didn't seem to matter. By morning he was exhausted. He sat on his porch, Max curled up beside him, staring at the ramp, still there, still standing strong against the storm. He thought, maybe they're right. Maybe I can't win this. Just then, a voice called out from across the fence. Hey, you doing okay over there? It was Sarah, his next-door neighbor, mid-30s, kind eyes, always polite but quiet. She held an umbrella and a grocery bag. James gave a tired smile. I've had better days. She looked at the ramp, then at the red notice still taped to his door. They're really making you take that down? She asked softly. Yeah, he said. Apparently, it ruins the neighborhood's image. Sarah frowned. That's ridiculous. My brother's in a wheelchair. I know how much ramps matter. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Mind if I come in for a bit? James nodded. Inside they sat at the kitchen table. Sarah placed her bag down and said, Look, I work as a journalist for the Oakville Post. I've written about unfair HOA cases before. What they're doing sounds illegal, maybe even a violation of disability rights. James looked up, surprised. You're serious? She nodded. Absolutely. If you're willing, I can help you look into their bylaws, maybe find something they don't want you to see. For the first time in days, James felt a spark of hope. All right, he said slowly. Let's do it. That afternoon they started digging. Sarah brought her laptop and a stack of HOA documents she found online. They read through every page, boring lines about fences, paint colors, mailbox designs, until finally something stood out. Buried deep in the rules was a section most people never read. Section 22, Accessibility Clause. Reasonable accommodations must be provided for residents with disabilities, in accordance with federal and state law. Sarah's eyes widened. James, this means they can't legally force you to remove the ramp. He leaned forward, disbelief turning into relief. So they've been lying to me? She nodded. Looks like it. They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the rain softening outside. Max wagged his tail as if he understood something big had just happened. Sarah smiled. If they don't want to play fair, we'll make sure everyone knows. Let's tell your story, the right way. James looked at her, gratitude filling his eyes. He didn't expect anyone to stand by him. But here was someone who believed in doing what's right, no matter how small the fight seemed. He reached over, tapping the notice on the table. All right, HO, he murmured. You wanted a battle? You just got one. As Sarah packed up her laptop, lightning flashed through the window, bright and sharp. Outside, the storm had finally stopped. Inside, a new kind of storm was just beginning. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds for the first time in days. The storm had passed, but for James, the real storm was just getting started. Sarah arrived early, laptop under her arm, determination in her eyes. Ready to dig deeper? She asked. James nodded, wheeling himself toward the kitchen table already covered with papers, printouts, and coffee mugs. The two of them had spent half the night reading HOA rules line by line. They had already found the accessibility clause, but Sarah had a gut feeling there was more hidden beneath the surface. HOAs love to hide behind fancy words, she said, scrolling through the digital files. They'll twist the rules until people give up. But not us. As she read aloud, James listened carefully. There were pages about lawn heights, garage doors, mailbox paint, endless nonsense. Then Sarah stopped. Wait, "This part doesn't make sense," she whispered. James looked over. "What is it?" She pointed to a small paragraph near the bottom of the page, written in tiny letters, almost hidden between two unrelated sections. Article 29, Section D. Reasonable structural modifications required for accessibility shall be deemed approved by default if not rejected within 14 days of notice. Sarah's eyes widened. "James, this means if they didn't respond to your ramp request within 2 weeks, it's automatically approved." James blinked. "But I never even submitted a request. I built the ramp, then got a violation notice right after." Sarah smirked. "Exactly. Which means they violated their own rules. They never gave you the chance to request it. That's a big mistake on their part." A slow smile crept across James's face. "So they've been breaking their own laws all along." Sarah nodded. "And once the public finds out, they're going to regret every letter they sent you." That's when she had an idea. "Let's bring this to light. I'll write the article, a full piece on veterans and accessibility rights being violated by HOAs. We'll include your story, your photos, even the letter they sent you." James hesitated. "That's going to make them furious." She shrugged. "Good. Maybe they need to be." By evening, Sarah's article was ready. She titled it, "HOA Bans Veterans Wheelchair Ramp, but the Law Says Otherwise." It was short, sharp, and powerful. She hit publish. Within hours, the post began spreading online. First a few local shares. Then it hit the front page of a local news forum. Comments flooded in. "Unbelievable. How can they do this to a veteran? Typical HOA nonsense. Where can we donate to help this man?" By nightfall, James's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Local reporters called. A radio host wanted to interview him. The HOA's quiet little neighborhood was suddenly the center of attention, and not in a good way. Across the street, lights flickered on in the homes of HOA board members. Curtains moved. Phones rang. The whispers had started. The next morning, the HOA president, Mr. Collins, sent an email to all homeowners. "Do not engage with the media. The board is handling the situation internally." But it was already too late. The story had gone public. Sarah smiled as she showed James the growing news coverage. "You did it," she said. James shook his head. "No, we did it." He looked out the window at his ramp, sunlight shining across it like a spotlight. It wasn't just wood and nails anymore. It was a symbol. What the HOA thought was a simple fight over rules was now something much bigger. And deep down, James knew, the real battle hadn't even begun yet. By the next morning, everything had changed. James woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop. Messages, calls, emails, all from strangers offering support. Veterans, disability advocates, and even people from other states were reaching out. "We stand with you. That HOA should be ashamed. You're an inspiration, James." He couldn't believe it. Just 2 days ago he had felt completely alone. Now people from everywhere were cheering him on. But not everyone was happy. Across the neighborhood, the HOA board was in full panic mode. Their inboxes were flooded. News vans had started parking near the front gate. Even local TV crews were trying to get a statement. Mr. Collins, the HOA president, called an emergency meeting. When James rolled into the community hall that evening, the atmosphere was tense. Residents filled every chair. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. Collins cleared his throat and tried to speak over the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, we understand that recent events have caused unnecessary attention." The board. A voice from the crowd cut him off. "Unnecessary attention? You embarrassed our entire neighborhood." Heads turned. It was Mrs. Wilson, an elderly neighbor who had lived there for over 20 years. She stood up, trembling with anger. "You fined a disabled veteran for building a wheelchair ramp. How dare you call this unnecessary?" Applause broke out across the room. Another resident shouted, "You did the same to me when I planted flowers by my mailbox." And another, "You made my son repaint his fence 3 times because it was too bright." The room erupted. People who had stayed silent for years were finally speaking up. James watched stunned. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had been bullied by the HOA's endless rules. Collins slammed his hand on the table. "Order. Order, please." But no one was listening. Sarah, sitting near the back with her camera, quietly filmed the chaos. This was exactly what she had hoped for, the community finally seeing the truth. One resident stood up and said loudly, "We're starting a petition to remove this board." The crowd cheered. Collins' face turned red. He grabbed his papers and muttered something under his breath. "This meeting is adjourned." As the board members rushed out, reporters surrounded James. Microphones were everywhere. "Mr. Parker, how does it feel to have the community behind you?" He smiled, calm but proud. "It feels like justice is finally knocking on their door." That night, the story went national. TV stations replayed clips from the meeting. Headlines appeared online. "Veteran fights HOA and wins the neighborhood's heart." HOA faces backlash after banning wheelchair ramp. The HOA's reputation was collapsing faster than they could contain it. Neighbors who had once ignored James now waved to him as he passed by. Some even came over to thank him for standing up. "You gave us courage," one woman said, handing him a homemade pie. "We've all been scared of them for too long." James smiled warmly. No one should be scared to live in their own home. For the first time, Elmwood Drive felt like a community again, united, hopeful, alive. But deep down, James knew the HOA wouldn't go down quietly. Collins wasn't the kind of man to walk away without a fight. And the next move they made would push things to the breaking point. For a few days, the neighborhood stayed strangely quiet. The news coverage had calmed down, but the tension was still thick in the air, like a storm waiting to explode. James thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA had finally backed off. He was wrong. Early one morning, as he opened his front door, he froze. Another envelope was taped to the ramp, bright red, bold letters again. "Final notice, daily fines imposed, $500 per day until removal." He tore it open. The words hit him like a punch. They were doubling down. The HOA wasn't backing off, they were fighting back harder. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. Sarah showed up minutes later after getting his text. She read the notice and shook her head. "They're digging their own grave. They're violating federal law now, openly." James clenched his fists. "They think they can scare me. They think I'll just give up." Sarah's tone was calm but sharp. "Then let's make sure the right people hear about this." She made a few calls. Within 24 hours, a local attorney, a disability rights specialist, agreed to take the case pro bono. His name was Mr. Howard, a calm, determined man who had fought dozens of similar cases. When he arrived at James's home, he studied the ramp carefully. "They fined you for this?" he asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is exactly what the law protects." Howard pulled out a folder filled with legal documents. "We're filing a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It's called a fair housing violation. Once they investigate, the HOA won't know what hit them." James nodded, a mix of relief and anger building inside him. "They wanted a war," he said quietly. "Now they've got one." 2 weeks later, the HOA board gathered in their private office, faces pale, voices tense. Mr. Collins slammed a letter onto the table. This time it wasn't from James. It was from HUD, the federal government. Notice of investigation, alleged violation of Fair Housing Act, failure to provide reasonable accommodation. Collins' voice shook. "They actually went to the government? This is insane." One board member whispered, "We could lose the entire association." Outside, neighbors whispered as unfamiliar cars pulled into the community, federal investigators. They interviewed residents, inspected documents, took photos of the ramp. The HOA members tried to act calm, but their fears showed. Sarah watched from across the street, camera in hand. "They brought this on themselves," she said quietly. A week later, the verdict arrived. The HOA had been found guilty of discrimination and violation of accessibility laws. They were ordered to drop all fines immediately, pay damages to James for emotional distress, issue a public apology, undergo mandatory legal training. When James read the letter, he exhaled deeply, months of stress leaving his body at once. He looked at Sarah and smiled weakly. "It's over." But she shook her head gently. "Not yet. You still have to hear them say it." That weekend, the HOA called a mandatory community meeting. The room was packed again. Cameras were rolling. Every homeowner watched in silence as Mr. Collins stood at the front, his usual confidence gone. He cleared his throat, his voice trembling. "On behalf of the board," he began, "we deeply regret the distress caused to Mr. Parker. The HOA acknowledges that our actions were not in accordance with accessibility laws. We apologize." The room was silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. Soon everyone joined in. James didn't say anything. He just smiled, nodded once, and looked at Sarah. They had done it. The ramp wasn't just a ramp anymore. It was proof that one person's fight could change everything. But as the applause filled the room, Collins avoided eye contact. His hands were shaking. And in that moment, James realized something important. The HOA had finally learned its biggest lesson, and they would never forget it. Weeks passed. The air in the neighborhood felt lighter, calmer. The red envelopes were gone, replaced by friendly waves and quiet smiles. James could finally roll down his ramp without fear, without shame. Each morning he and Max would sit at the end of the ramp, watching the sunrise just like before. But this time it felt different. He wasn't trapped anymore. He was free. The story of his fight spread far beyond the neighborhood. News stations called him the veteran who stood up to the HOA. People across the country sent letters, strangers thanking him for his courage, others sharing how they too had been bullied by their HOA. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in another state. She wrote, "My husband's in a wheelchair too. Our HOA said no to a ramp last month, but because of your story they changed their mind. Thank you." James smiled as he read it. "That's why it was worth it," he said softly. Meanwhile, things inside the HOA boardroom had changed forever. Mr. Collins had resigned quietly. Half the board members quit after the scandal. The community elected new leaders, people who cared more about neighbors than rules. Every time they held a meeting, a framed photo of James's ramp hung on the wall as a reminder of what happens when power goes too far. A small plaque below it read, "Accessibility is not a privilege. It's a right." One afternoon Sarah stopped by, camera in hand again. She smiled as she saw James rolling down his ramp with ease. "So, any regrets?" she asked playfully. James chuckled. "Not mine," he said. Then he glanced at the HOA office across the street. "But I bet they have plenty." They both laughed, the sound warm and easy. Max barked happily, running ahead as they went for a walk, something James once thought he'd never do alone again. The camera slowly panned up to the blue sky, sunlight gleaming off the ramp's smooth rails. A simple structure built with hope had changed an entire community. Because sometimes all it takes is one person saying, "You can't take this from me." And that's how the HOA learned. Banning his ramp wasn't just their mistake, it was their biggest regret.